It's a structural issue. I mean, the supply chain is very tightly balanced because demand changes very quickly, up or down, whereas the supply side takes 2 years to build a new factory. So you're currently having this difference between short-term demand fluctuations and the ability to provide that. So you do go into shortages quite regularly. The industry is very cyclical. It's been that way since time began. And it is this difference between supply and demand lead times that causes it. So COVID was the trigger. That caused an instantaneous uptick in demand, which just tipped over the whole pile of bricks and they fell apart.
Well, a number of companies, especially in the auto sector, have, as you say, or in one of your recent reports, quote, run to their governments to seek political intervention. Why are they doing that, and was it inevitable?
Yes, it's human nature, I guess, really. I mean, no one wants to admit that it was them that got it wrong. So they run to Big Brother, hoping to use the big guns to get them out of trouble. But there's nothing governments can really do about it because you've got to build new capacity to solve this problem. And the problem was the customers never talked to their suppliers and never committed to take that capacity. So the suppliers said, I'm not going to build this capacity just on a promise that you might need it. These factories are too expensive to do that. So the industry needs to talk better with each other, and governments can't really do much about it. They can bluster and they can make posturing gestures, but at the end of the day, if governments force suppliers to favorize the automobile suppliers, some other sector will be held to ransom. So you're just moving the pot around. It's a zero-sum game.
So how much of it was down to this rising demand for electric vehicles and new iPhones?
They are the drivers for the industry, and that's what's been keeping it going. I mean, this time it is EV and it's iPhones and products like that. 20 years ago, it might have been computers or something. So these are the fundamental drivers. But the real fundamental problem was that there was no slack in the supply chain system. So when the automotive, and the problem was the automotive industry canceled all of their orders back in the March, April timeframe in 2020 when COVID hit. And then when they came to reinstate them, they'd kind of forgotten that it takes 4 to 6 months to actually reinstate those orders. That's the time it takes to make these parts.
So what can be done to correct or solve these supply chain issues? If it isn't at a government level, it has to come within the industry.
It has to come within the industry, and the industry's actually got to operate on a much more cooperative level than they have done in the past. And that probably actually means that they've got to commit to supplying and receiving capacity rather than parts. And it probably means for the bigger users that they've actually got to prepay for that capacity, and it will be non-cancelable, so that the supply chain is willing to invest the $10 billion that it costs to build a new factory, and knowing that they have some commitment to that rather than be left high and dry if demand happens to go sour.
Looking at the industry as a whole, Malcolm, it seems that there's a real race to become the world's top chip manufacturer. The EU and US have been quite forthright in their plans, haven't they? How do you see that playing out, and will it provide the capacity that is so obviously lacking?
Well, I mean, governments are probably keener on this than the chip companies are, actually, because most of the chip companies have actually been outsourcing their manufacturing to organizations like TSMC. So they've been quite happy not to make the parts themselves. And all these government plans we've seen, whether it's in the USA or in the EU, have been government-led initiatives. You haven't actually seen a lot of chip companies wanting to build new factories. They seem to think that they haven't really been convinced that they should get back in the game.
You've been in the semiconductor industry for half a century. It's an extremely long time. Is this the first big crisis it's faced?
No, it's probably number 16. These come with regular. They used to be every 4 to 5 years. We've had a long period where we haven't had a supply crisis. Probably since the financial crisis, really. And that's been more driven by the fact that the economy has been kind of bouncing along at fairly average levels since then. And so we've been lulled into this false sense of security that the cyclicality was over, but it isn't over. And with demand and supply get out of balance, then it will happen just like it's happened again. It will happen again in the future. I'm convinced of that, simply because of the 2 years lead time to build a new factory. And it's only when companies start to buy capacity and users and suppliers get together on a very collaborative, cooperative basis, will you see this come anywhere near under control.
Is this an example of the so-called Moore's law? And you know what Moore's law is, the observation that the number of transistors in a circuit doubles every 2 years. Is the business capable of sustaining that kind of growth?
Oh, people ask me that question all the time. I have no concerns about growth. I mean, this industry is so creative. Its ability to open up new markets, to enable us to do things that were unimaginable even 5 years ago, is almost inexhaustible. And when you look at the new applications in medicine, in automotive cars, in artificial intelligence, in all of these kind of areas here, there are so many opportunities which we can't do today because either it's too expensive or the compute power isn't quite good enough to actually do those. That problem is solved by the innovation within the industry. So there's a lot more scope for this industry to keep going and deliver the power and making our lives more easy and more fun.
Malcolm Penn, many thanks for joining us here on The Agenda.
Thanks very much indeed, Stephen.